The year was 1841, and the raw edge of the frontier breathed wild and untamed around Fort Bridger, that new-made post of log and mud built by Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez. It squatted in a valley hemmed by the gray bones of the Uinta Mountains, the air sharp with pine and snowmelt, the nights alive with wolf song and the pop of rifle fire echoing down the draw. Word had it that the beaver trade was dying, felt hats gone out of fashion back east, and the rivers that once glittered with fortune now lay near trapped out. But for the ragged breed of mountain men, drifters, and cutthroats who haunted those passes, the frontier was still the last refuge left where a man's name and nerve were worth more than coin. Among them was Elias Carter, once a hand with the American Fur Company, one of Ashley's men in the good days when the Green River Rendezvous could bring in 500 trappers and traders, when whiskey flowed from tin cups and the sky itself seemed big enough to hold every dream a man could conjure. But those days had burned out like the embers of a winter fire. Elias had outlasted most of his breed, though not without a toll. Somewhere along the Yellowstone River, in a winter so bitter that the hides froze solid before they could be skinned, he'd lost his right hand to frostbite. By the time the thaw came, he was a one-handed trapper in a two-handed trade. He drifted south that spring, following the familiar trails, the Bozeman Cutoff, the old Snake River crossings, and finally the Green River Trail that led to Bridger's new fort. The country there still bore the smell of gunpowder and mule sweat, of pine smoke from half-built cabins and the sour musk of buffalo robes. For a spell, Elias trapped what he could, trading at the post for powder, tobacco, and the cheap whiskey Bridger hauled in by wagon. But the truth was plain. A man couldn't live on pelts no more. The fur companies had gone under, and the Rocky Mountain trade had shrunk to a trickle of hide dealers and Indian traders. So Elias did what no sane man on the frontier would have dreamed. He built a saloon. It wasn't much to look at. The logs were rough-hewn and chinked with mud that flaked in the dry wind. The roof sagged like an old mule's back, and the door was a leftover wagon board. Inside there was one long plank table, a few mismatched chairs, and a counter made from a section of pine balanced on old whiskey barrels. The bar shelves held only a half-dozen bottles of rotgut whiskey, a coffee pot, and a few clay pipes. He called it the Fool's Rest. When asked why, he'd only grin with that weathered face and say, because a fool's the only man who'd build one this far from a town. The name stuck. The first to mock him were his own kind, the trappers and mule drivers who'd spent their lives chasing beaver through the Rockies. They'd laugh from their saddle seats when they saw the crooked sign over the door. "A saloon, Carter? Out here?" one of them jeered. "Ain't no customers but wolves and whiskey thieves." Even Jim Bridger himself, passing by with a pack train bound for the Wind River Range, shook his head and muttered, "Carter, you're a damn fool. A saloon in no man's land? You'll be lucky if you live through the first winter." But Elias was a stubborn breed of fool. He'd seen enough killing, freezing, and starving to know that sometimes a man just needed a roof, a drink, and a place to set his bones by the fire. That was reason enough. So he went on patching his roof and carving his own tankards out of cottonwood, ignoring the mockery. By late summer, the Fool's Rest had become a curious landmark, a beacon for the lost and the reckless. Freighters from the Platte Country, Shoshone hunters, even the occasional Oregon-bound emigrant stopped to rest their teams and trade tales for a drink. The whiskey was thin and burned like gun oil, but Elias poured it steady, and even his wooden hand fitted with a crude iron hook that could still lift a bottle or swing a rifle when need called. He ran the place by a simple rule: no guns drawn, no credit given, and no fighting that spilled a man's blood on his floorboards. The first two were negotiable. The third was not. Outside the saloon, the frontier itself was changing. The once glorious fur trade routes, the old Missouri line, the Snake, the Green, the Yellowstone, were turning into corridors for new blood. The Oregon Trail cut across the plains now, filled with wagons and dreams heading west. The mountain men, those lean, wild ghosts who once owned the wilderness, were dying out or turning to guides for settlers. Across the wide Missouri, as Bernard DeVoto would later write, the age of the lone trapper was giving way to the age of the plow. Elias Carter could feel it. Each passing wagon train carried the smell of changed women's voices, children laughing, preachers talking of civilization. The land that had once belonged to wolves, trappers, and the Crow was being claimed by farmers and soldiers. But for the moment, this narrow stretch near Bridger's Fort was still wild, a place where law came only at the muzzle of a rifle. One evening in late September, as the wind howled off the Uintas and rattled the shutters of the Fool's Rest, a band of trappers rode in from the Green River country. They were a rough lot, bearded, sunburnt, and drunk on their own legend. One, a man named Caleb Varn, slammed through the door and took a long look around. "So this here's the famous Fool's Rest," he said with a grin that showed a gold tooth. "Hell, Carter, I figured it'd be burnt down by now." Elias just nodded, wiping the counter with his good hand. "Still standin', Caleb." Varn laughed and slapped the counter. "Pour me something that'll kill a snake." Elias did. The whiskey caught fire in the lamplight as he poured, and the trappers drank deep, telling stories of Jedediah, Smith, Hugh Glass, and the old brigades that once ranged the Yellowstone. Their laughter filled the low rafters, but Elias kept his distance, watching the men's eyes and their hands. The frontier had taught him that trouble came quiet like snow. It covered everything before a man knew he was cold. When the bottle was near empty, Varn leaned across the counter. "You ever think, Carter, that you're wastin' what's left of your life tendin' this hole? There's still gold out there, and pelts in the high country." Elias looked at him steadily. "I got my fill of frost and blood. A man's got to rest sometime." "Rest," Varn spat. "Ain't no rest west of the Missouri. You're just waitin' for the grave." The others laughed, and for a heartbeat, Elias thought he saw something mean behind their eyes, something that had no humor in it. But he said nothing, only turned back to stoke the fire. Later that night, after the trappers had gone, the wind died, leaving only the creak of the timbers and the hiss of the dying flame. Elias sat alone behind the counter, staring into the coals. Outside, the prairie stretched into blackness, broken only by the faint light of Bridger's Fort a few miles off. He thought of the days when he'd ridden the river valleys with men who were now bones beneath the sagebrush: Smith, Sublet, Provost, Glass. They had hunted the wilderness and been hunted by it, men of powder and hide who carved their names on a land too vast to remember them. Elias Carter had no illusions of glory. His saloon was nothing more than a shack of logs and whiskey fumes, mocked by every outlaw and wanderer that passed. Yet, as he listened to the wind roll down from the mountains, he smiled faintly. Mock him they might. But come winter, when the snow sealed the passes and the wolves sang along the ridge, every man in that country, outlaw or honest, would come looking for light, warmth, and a measure of peace. And they'd find it, there at the Fool's Rest. By the first thaw of 1842, the Fool's Rest had become more than a joke whispered along the trails. It was a way station, half refuge and half rumor, standing like a stubborn outpost against the emptiness of the Wyoming basin. Every man who came down from the high country seemed to drift through its door sooner or later. Shoshone hunters, Crow scouts, mule skinners, and the last free trappers still clinging to the old life. They came with packs of pelts, half-starved mules, and stories big enough to fill a canyon. Elias Carter served them all the same quietly, without judgment, pouring whiskey from his chipped bottle with the same left hand that had once hauled beaver traps from the ice. His iron hook clinked against the bottlenecks like a steady metronome, a sound the regulars came to trust. Inside, the air always carried the same mix of sweat, wood smoke, and old tobacco. A single lantern hung from the rafter, and beneath it gathered a company of men. Bound by hardship more than kinship, they spoke the language of the mountains, short words, long silences, and the unspoken bond of shared danger. The names that passed their lips were the legends of the frontier. Jedediah Smith, killed by Comanche on the Cimarron. Hugh Glass, mauled and left for dead, but who crawled 300 miles to live again. Kit Carson, that quiet-spoken scout who had guided more men through the wilderness than any map ever drawn. Elias had known two of them in passing, traded pelts alongside Carson once on the Green River, and heard Smith preach before the last rendezvous at the Popo Egi. He didn't speak much of it. Men who'd lived long in the mountains didn't brag. They just endured. Still, he listened. And in the long winter nights, when the wind drove snow through the cracks in his walls, he heard the talk turn darker. The beaver trade was dead, and the companies had folded or gone east. Powder and ball had replaced traps and knives. The new breed of men freighters, teamsters, and horse thieves were filling the empty trails. The Green River Valley had become a no-man's land between traders and bandits, its forts more often shelters for fugitives than commerce. It was around that time that a name began to hang like smoke over the Saloon, Caleb Varn. Varn had been one of Bridger's men once, a trapper with a sharp eye and a cruel streak. When the trade collapsed, he turned his gun to easier pickings, runaway horses, loose stock, and supply trains heading west. His outfit numbered half a dozen hard men outlaws who rode light and shot quicker than they spoke. They drifted between Fort Hall, Fort Laramie, and the Bridger country, taking what they wanted and burning what they couldn't carry. One cold morning, Elias found their sign near his claim, hoofprints along the creek, a half-burned fire, and a mule carcass stripped of meat. He said nothing of it when he rode to the fort for supplies, but word was already spreading. The traders cursed Varn's name in 3 languages, and even the Shoshone whispered it like an ill omen. That night, the saloon filled with talk. The trappers hunched over the fire, their faces flickering in the light. Varn's gang took 3 pack mules off the Oregon Trail party, one said. Killed a man named Harris, buried him in the sand. Should have known better to travel with just 2 rifles, another muttered. This country's turning to hell. Elias stood behind the counter, listening. You ever think maybe hell was already here, he said, and we just built cabins in it? That drew a low chuckle, but it wasn't humor that followed, it was fear, worn under the skin. When the talk quieted, an old French trapper named Baptiste Duval leaned in. "Eh, Carter," he said in his thick accent. "You was with de American fur, non? You know dessamen? Oui? Dey come from dat trade." Elias nodded. "Some of 'em. Lost men. When the fur went, so did their souls." He remembered a younger time when the rendezvous at Pierre's Hole had brought together 2,000 souls traders, Indians, and mountain men from every tribe of the wilderness. He could still smell the hides, the black powder, the whiskey spilled in the grass. It had been a world of risk, but also of rule the mountain code, unwritten yet understood. A man's word meant life or death. Theft, betrayal, and cowardice were repaid in lead or exile. But that old code was crumbling now. The men who came into the Fool's Rest weren't bound by it. They were cut loose from law, tribe, and trade alike, men of powder and hide, but no honor. As the weeks passed, the saloon grew busier. Varn's gang came through twice, swaggering and loud, their saddlebags fat with stolen goods. They bought whiskey by the bottle and paid with gold teeth, silver buttons, anything that would pass for coin. Elias served them without word or favor. He could feel the danger in the air, sharp as the scent of pine before lightning. "Don't like them men," said Baptiste one night after they'd gone. "Dey bring bad spirit." Elias nodded. "Aye, but bad spirits always come before a reckoning." That spring, a wagon party bound for Oregon stopped at the saloon. Their leader, a gray-eyed man named Ezekiel Horn, warned of Varn's gang shadowing them through the canyon. "They took 2 oxen and left a dead mule as a warning," Horn said, his voice flat. "We buried what they left of him." Elias stared into the fire, feeling the land grow smaller, meaner. The West he'd known was slipping away, replaced by greed and cruelty in the skin of men. The old frontier, where survival had been a test of grit, was now turning to bandit country. But the Fool's Rest still stood. That night, as he locked the door and doused the lamps, Elias heard the faint cry of coyotes beyond the ridge. He thought of the trappers he'd known, their courage, their madness, their strange brotherhood. He missed that wild company, even in its savagery. Now he served whiskey to ghosts. And somewhere out there, under the same moonlight, Caleb Varn and his men rode the dark trails, laughing into the wind. Elias Carter knew the laughter would one day come knocking. By midsummer, the air in the high valley had turned dry and mean. The wind blew hot out of the canyons, carrying the dust of buffalo bones and the distant echo of gunfire. The hills above Fort Bridger shimmered in heat, and every man who rode into the Fool's Rest seemed on edge, short of temper, quick to draw, and slower to pay. Elias Carter could feel it in his bones. Trouble was coming. The decline of the fur trade had left a vacuum, and in the wilderness, nature abhorred a vacuum almost as much as man. Where trappers once bartered in pelts and powder, horse thieves and whiskey gangs now ruled the trails. Caleb Varn's crew had taken the Green River country for their own. They haunted the wagon tracks and creek crossings, extorting tolls from travelers and leaving corpses as receipts. Still, the saloon stood open, a flicker of lamplight against the endless dark. That evening, Elias was cleaning his flintlock when the door slammed open. 3 riders came in, dust-coated and loud, their coats patched with grease and powder burns. At their center was Caleb Varn, his hair longer now, his face leaner, eyes sharp as a hawk's. The men stank of sweat, blood, and stolen whiskey. "Well, if it ain't the fool himself," Varn drawled, dropping his rifle on the counter. "Still serving mule piss to the desperate?" Elias said nothing. He set down the rifle and nodded toward the shelf. "Bottles the same as before. Price ain't changed." Varn grinned. "That's the problem with you, Carter. You're the only man west of Street Lewis who don't know how to bend." The gang laughed. Elias poured their whiskey anyway, slow, deliberate, each cup filled to the same line. When he set them down, his hook tapped the table once, the same steady rhythm that marked every pour. They drank hard. The laughter got louder, sharper. Outside, the twilight deepened, painting the valley in bruised colors. The trappers who usually gathered in the corner had gone silent. Even Baptiste Duval, the old Frenchman, kept his head down. The smell of gun oil and fear hung heavy in the air. Varn leaned across the counter. "Heard you been shelterin' wagoners," he said. "Word is you gave them Oregon folks food and whiskey, no charge." Elias's eyes met his. "They had sick children. You'd have done the same." "Would I?" Varn's grin faded. "That's your problem, Carter. You still think the West's got a heart. It don't. It's a beast, and beasts only respect teeth." He slapped a silver coin on the counter, one side smooth, the other stamped with a Mexican eagle. "That's payment for the whiskey. But next time you pour for them, trail folk, remember you're cutting my profits." Elias didn't move. "Your profits don't concern me." "They will," Varn said softly, "if you want to keep breathing." For a long moment, the saloon was silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Then Elias turned, his hook glinting in the lamplight, and poured himself a drink. "You done threatenin' me, Caleb? Or are you just drunk enough to forget what kind of man I used to be?" The room froze. Varn stared at him, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Used to be," he said. "That's the word. Used to." He grabbed the bottle and swung it like a club. Elias ducked the blow, shattered glass across the wall. The next second was chaos. Chairs scraped, pistols cleared leather. Baptiste dove for cover behind the stove. Elias came up with the butt of his flintlock and smashed it into the side of Varn's jaw. The outlaw stumbled, blood spattering the counter. "Kill him!" one of the men shouted. "Gunfire!" roared. The lamp went out, plunging the saloon into blackness. Smoke filled the room, choking, acrid. Elias fired blind toward the muzzle flashes, then rolled behind the counter. The wooden wall splintered as bullets punched through. When the smoke cleared, one man lay dead on the floor, face down, blood pooling beneath him. Varn was gone, dragged out by his last man, shouting curses into the dark. Elias stood there, breathing hard, his arm bleeding from a graze. The saloon smelled of powder and whiskey, of death and fear. Baptiste crawled out from behind the stove, eyes wide. "Mon Dieu, Carter," he whispered. "You kill one of Varn's men. Dey come back, dey burn dis place." Elias sat down slow, reloading his flintlock with steady hands. "Then we'll be ready." Outside, the wind howled across the plains, scattering the last light of day. The world felt emptier, colder. Over the next week, the valley bristled with tension. Travelers spoke of finding burned camps, dead mules, missing wagons. Men rode armed now, even to fetch water. The small community that had formed around Fort Bridger began to whisper that Elias Carter's saloon was cursed. But the old trapper didn't waver. Each night he lit his lantern, opened his door, and stood behind the counter like a sentinel. The floorboards still bore the dark stain of blood, but he didn't wash it away. "Let it stay," he told Baptiste. "Reminds men what whiskey and pride can cost." By the time autumn touched the high ridges with snow, Varne's gang had vanished into the Badlands. Some said they'd gone north to Fort Hall, others that they were raiding emigrant trains along the Sweetwater River. Elias didn't believe they were gone. He could feel it like thunder you can't yet hear but know is coming. The Fool's Rest stood quiet in the fading light, its windows glowing like tired eyes. Inside, Elias sat by the fire, oiling his rifle. The frontier outside had gone from wild to wicked, and he knew the line between lawman and outlaw was as thin as paper. He'd killed before men and animals both, but this time it was different. He wasn't defending a trapline or a pelt, he was defending a place. A foolish little saloon in the heart of no man's land that somehow had become home. And Elias Carter, one-handed fool or not, meant to keep it. Winter came early to the Bridger country that year. By mid-October, the mountain passes were already choked with snow, and the willows along the Green River stood bare and brittle as bone. The wind poured down from the high peaks with a voice like something ancient and hungry. For those who stayed through the season, survival became a calculation of wood, meat, and nerve. Elias Carter had all three, though not much more. He'd patched the bullet holes in the saloon walls with wagon planks, stacked elk hides against the drafts, and laid in a small store of venison. The whiskey barrels were half empty, but that didn't trouble him. Few travelers came now, only the desperate or the lost. The Fool's Rest stood alone against the valley snow, smoke curling weakly from its chimney, a fool's beacon in a white world. When the cold grew too thick to breathe, Elias sat by the fire, his iron hook resting against his knee, and drifted back to the life he'd left behind the trapper years. He had been 24 when he first rode up the Missouri River with a brigade of the American Fur Company. It was the spring of 1829, the golden time when beaver pelts could buy a man more whiskey than he could drink, and a rifle fine enough to outlast him. He remembered the riverboats groaning against the current, the smell of pitch and hides, and the shouts of men loading traps. There had been Frenchmen, Iroquois, half-breeds, and greenhorns from every corner of the East, all bound for the wilderness where the map turned blank. He'd trapped with Sublet's men near the Bighorn Mountains, survived a Blackfeet, ambush on the Yellowstone, and wintered once with the Crow on the Powder River. In those days, he'd thought the mountains would never die. But the trade ended as quickly as it had begun. When the beaver hats went out of style in Europe, everything changed, men became expendable, rivers went quiet, and the wilderness that had once seemed infinite suddenly felt empty. That was the year he lost his hand. It happened in a blizzard that roared for 6 straight days. His camp had been cut off, his traps frozen solid in the ice. When he finally tried to haul them out barehanded, his fingers turned black before morning. By the time the thaw came, he'd carved away what the frost had taken, sealing the stump with hot pitch. After that, he wasn't Elias the trapper anymore, just Elias Carter, the half-hand fool, still breathing when better men were gone. He'd thought of dying then. But the mountains had other plans. Among the Crow, there had been a boy, maybe 12 years old, named Two Elks. Elias had found him one spring, half buried in snow, shot through the shoulder after a raid gone bad. He carried the boy back to camp, nursed him with what little whiskey and sinew he had, and never asked for thanks. Two Elks had followed him after that, quiet as shadow, learning his traps, his language, and his patience. When Elias left the Crow years later, the boy had wept without shame. They had parted with a promise. If ever the other called, he would come. He had not thought of that promise in years until the morning the wolf tracks appeared near the creek. It was the kind of sign only an old trapper would notice. The prints were too heavy for a single animal, the stride too cautious, as if the wolf had learned human rhythm. That evening, as the sun fell like blood behind the ridges, a figure appeared on the slope wrapped in fur, carrying a bow and rifle both. The door creaked open, and a familiar voice spoke from the shadows. "Still alive, old one-handed man?" Elias looked up and grinned through his beard. 2 elks. The crow stepped into the lamplight. His hair was long now, bound with sinew, and his face lined with years of wind and smoke. He carried himself with the same stillness Elias remembered a hunter's patience. They clasped arms in silence, the way men do when words are too small. Then 2 elks said, "The valley is not safe. The bad ones, men with no hearts, they come from the south. I saw their fires last night." "Varn," Elias said. 2 elks nodded. "Yes, they take horses and women from the Shoshone. They will come here soon." Elias's jaw tightened. "I figured as much. I killed one of his men. He's not the kind to forget." 2 elks walked the room, studying the walls, the shutters, the weak points. "You built a lodge with open sides," he said softly. "It will not stand a fight." "Then we'll make it stand," Elias said. For 2 days they worked without rest. They dragged wagon boards too, braced the door, packed snow and mud into the cracks, and built a trench behind the saloon wall for cover. 2 elks rigged deadfall traps near the creek logs bound by rawhide, ready to crush anyone who rode too close. At night they spoke little. The wind howled through the eaves, and the fire snapped like a living thing. "Tell me," 2 elks said one night, "why you stay here, alone? There is no tribe, no woman, no life in this place." Elias poked the coals with his hook. "Because I've been running my whole life, chasin' beaver, dodgin' death, livin' for the next trade. A man's got to stop somewhere and make his stand. Might as well be where the world calls him fool." 2 elks nodded slowly. "Then I will stand with you." Outside, snow drifted against the windows, muffling the world. The saloon creaked in the wind, its rough timbers groaning like an old ship. Inside, 2 men sat across the fire, one white, one crow, both relics of a time the New West was, trying hard to forget. Through the smoke, Elias poured them each a cup of whiskey. "2 fools," he said. 2 elks raised his tin cup, "to the last of them." And as they drank, the mountains beyond Bridger's fort lay silent, waiting for the blood and fire that would come before spring. The snow was still deep on the slopes when the trouble came. The dawn broke gray and bitter, the kind of cold that turns breath to frost before it leaves a man's mouth. The Fool's Rest stood hunched under its snow-heavy roof, the chimney coughing a thin thread of smoke into the pale sky. Inside, Elias Carter and 2 elks finished the last of the venison stew in silence. Both men had been awake since before light. They could feel it in the air, the quiet before the storm. 2 elks had gone out before dawn and come back with word. Caleb Varn's gang was in the valley. 6 riders, maybe more, camped by the creek where the cottonwoods bent with the wind. They had torches, rifles, and the look of men who had come to finish something. Elias set his tin bowl aside and reached for his rifle. "Guess we'll have company for breakfast," he said. 2 elks nodded, face expressionless. They move when the sun climbs the ridge. They spent the hour before dawn checking every corner of the saloon. The windows were boarded, the powder kegs stacked near the back wall. The roof leak had frozen over, the ice catching the dull light like a blade. Elias poured a handful of powder into his palm, testing the grain, dry enough to burn clean. 2 elks unrolled a rawhide bundle, 4 arrows tipped with iron, and a short crow bow, polished from years of care. "I shoot the first," he said. "You shoot the last." Outside, the world held its breath. By mid-morning the riders appeared, small dark figures cutting through the snowdrifts. They came slow, wary, their horses snorting steam. Elias counted them 7, not 6. Varn rode in front, a red scarf tied round his neck, his rifle across his saddle. Even from a distance, Elias could see the grin on his face. The outlaw raised a hand, signaling halt. Then he called out, his voice echoing against the hills. "Carter, you in there, old fool?" Elias stepped to the doorway, rifle in hand. "Still here, Varn. You look cold. Come on in. Fire's warm." Varn laughed. "We'll be warmer when we burn you out." He swung down from his horse, drew his pistol, and fired a single shot into the air. The echo rolled across the valley like thunder. That was the start. The first volley shattered the windows. Splinters flew. Elias ducked behind the counter, returning fire through a narrow slit between the boards. His shot caught one of the riders in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The man screamed, then fell silent in the snow. Two elks loosed an arrow that flew straight and silent as death. It struck another outlaw through the neck. The man gurgled once and dropped. The others took cover behind the corral fence, firing blindly toward the saloon. Bullets thudded into the logs, punching small holes that leaked powder smoke and cold air. Inside, the room filled with haze. The smell of sulfur and blood mixed with the faint sweetness of spilled whiskey. "5 left," Elias muttered, reloading. His hook clinked against the ramrod. "They'll try to flank from the east." 2 elks nodded. "I make them chase me." Before Elias could stop him, the crow slipped out the back door and vanished into the snow. Moments later, 2 shots rang out in the distance. Then silence. Elias cursed under his breath, heart hammering. He fired again through the front slit, saw one man crumple behind his horse and another run screaming toward the creek. Minutes dragged like hours. Then the world exploded. A torch arced through the broken window, landing in the spilled whiskey behind the bar. Flames leapt instantly, crawling up the wall in orange tongues. Elias grabbed a bucket of snow and threw it, smothering part of the blaze, but smoke filled the room. From outside came Varn's voice, raw and wild. "Burn, you bastard! Burn like you burned my men!" Elias felt his lungs choke on the smoke. He staggered to the powder kegs in the corner, the old stock he'd been saving since Bridger's last trade. He smiled grimly. If the place was going to burn, he'd make sure it burned on his terms. He pulled one keg close, pried it open, and began pouring a trail of powder toward the back door. The line glittered faintly in the firelight. Then a shadow moved outside the doorway, a shape too tall for any man. Elias froze, rifle raised. The door burst open, and 2 elks stumbled in, blood on his arm but eyes bright. "They are coming close," he said. "Now we finish it." Together they crouched by the doorway. When the gang rushed the front, shouting and firing, Elias struck his flint. The powder trail hissed like a snake. "Out!" he shouted, grabbing 2 elks by the shoulder. They dove through the back window into the snow as the saloon behind them erupted. The explosion rolled across the valley, a thunderclap of fire and splintered wood. The front wall blew outward, scattering men and horses alike. The night sky turned orange, sparks rising like stars. When the smoke cleared, only 3 men were left standing, Varn among them, coughing and staggering through the wreckage. His coat was on fire. He tore it off and turned, pistol in hand, face twisted with rage. Elias stepped from the shadows, rifle leveled. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You should have stayed in the high country, Caleb." Varn aimed, but he was too slow. The rifle cracked once. Varn fell backward into the snow, the red scarf spreading around his neck like a pool of sunset. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the wind came, low and steady, carrying away the last of the smoke. The Fool's Rest was gone, half buried, half burning, a ruin of blackened logs and dreams. 2 elks stood beside Elias, breathing hard. "It is finished," he said. Elias looked at the wreckage, the place he'd built with his own broken hands. "No," he said softly. "It's just begun." He turned toward the faint lights of Fort Bridger flickering against the night horizon. Behind him, the fire of his saloon crackled and hissed, dying slow in the snow and ending, and the beginning of a legend men would whisper about for years to come. The fire from the Fool's Rest still smoked 3 days later, when Elias Carter and 2 elks rode through the snow toward Fort Bridger. Behind them lay blackened timbers, burned wagons, and the frozen remains of Caleb Varn's men. The smell of char still clung to their clothes. Every gust of wind carried the memory of that night rifle, fire, screams, and the boom of the powder that had turned the valley into firelight. Elias didn't speak on the ride. He sat stiff in the saddle, his rifle slung across his back, his left hand wrapped in a bloody cloth. 2 elks rode beside him, wounded but steady, his expression unreadable. They both knew what lay ahead. Killing outlaws wasn't a crime on the frontier, but burning down a saloon, even your own, drew questions. Fort Bridger appeared out of the gray distance, just a sprawl of log stockades and low cabins, but to the men who roamed the mountains, it was as close to civilization as the wilderness had. Smoke rose from its chimneys, and the sound of hammers echoed through the cold air. Men in buckskins and buffalo coats moved between the buildings, faces red from the wind. When Elias and 2 elks rode through the gates, every head turned. "God Almighty," someone muttered. "That's Carter, the fool from the valley." Word had already traveled faster than hoofbeats. By the time they dismounted, Jim Bridger himself came striding from the trading post, his long coat snapping in the wind. His beard was silvering now, but his eyes were sharp and clear, the same as they'd been when he'd guided Ashley's men through the Rockies. "Carter," Bridger said, folding his arms, "you look like hell warmed over. What in blazes happened down there?" Elias took a slow breath. "Varn's gang came for me. 7 men. Only 2 rode away, and they won't last long." Bridger studied him a moment. "And your saloon?" "Gone," Elias said. "I burned it along with them." Bridger's jaw tightened. "You burned it?" Elias met his gaze. "Better I burn it than let them take it. They'd have turned it into a den for worse devils than themselves." There was a long silence. Finally, Bridger sighed. "You know, men'll talk. They'll say you killed them out of pride, not survival." "Men always talk," Elias said quietly. "Truth doesn't change for their tongues." That night, the courtyard filled with trappers, freighters, and Indians alike. Bridger called for a council of judgment, the old frontier way. There were no courts. Out here, no sheriffs or lawyers. Only men who knew the weight of life and death and what both cost in blood. Inside the fort's great hall, the fire roared in the hearth. The men gathered in a rough circle, 15 in all. Baptiste Duval was there, his arm in a sling from an earlier scrape. Old Louis Vasquez, Bridger's partner, leaned on a cane by the door. In one corner sat 2 Shoshone elders who had traded with Bridger since the founding of the fort. Bridger stood and looked around. "We're here to settle what happened down the green," he said. "Elias Carter, trapper turned barkeep, stands before us accused by rumor of killin' men and destroyin' property. He claims self-defense." "Let him speak." Elias stepped forward, the firelight flickering across his face. "I won't waste your time," he said. "Varn's men came to rob, burn, and kill. You all know what kind they were. They'd been taking stock from the wagon trains and scalping the unlucky. I warned them to stay clear. They didn't listen. When they came for me, I fought back. That's all there is." He paused, letting the words hang heavy. "If it's a crime to defend your roof, then I'm guilty. But I've lived by one code all my life, the mountain code. You take what's yours, you give what you owe, and you never draw first unless you mean to finish it." There was a murmur from the crowd. The Shoshone elders nodded, understanding more from his tone than his words. Bridger looked at 2 elks. "You back his story?" The Crow warrior stood. His voice was calm, his English rough. "The men who came were killers. I saw their eyes. I saw them burn camps, take horses, and shoot the weak. We buried 2 women they left by the river. Carter fought them true. He burned his own lodge to save others. That is not a crime among my people." Bridger leaned on the table, fingers drumming. "And Varn?" "Dead," Elias said. "He earned it." Bridger was silent a long while. Then he spoke. "Every man here knows this country runs on blood and honor. We got no law but what we make. Elias Carter did what he had to, same as any of us might have done." He turned to the circle. "All in favor of clearing his name?" The room filled with a chorus of low eyes. Even those who doubted him raised their hands. Only Vasquez hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Bridger faced Elias. "Then it's settled. You're a free man. But you'll rebuild that place come spring. Not for whiskey, for rest. This country needs a place where men can lay down their rifles without fear." Elias's expression softened for the first time in days. "Maybe I will. Call it something else this time." "Don't," Bridger said, grinning. "Keep the name, the Fool's Rest. It suits you, and it suits this land. We're all fools out here, one way or another." Laughter rippled through the hall, weary but honest. That night, Elias slept under Bridger's roof, for the first time since he'd come west. The wind rattled the shutters, and the fire burned low, but his sleep was deep and dreamless. When dawn came, he and 2 Elks saddled their horses and rode east out of the fort. The world lay washed in gold, snow sparkling under the sun. Behind them, Bridger's men were already talking about the fool who'd burned his own saloon to keep the peace, about the crow who'd fought beside him, about how even in a land with no law, honor still held the line. And somewhere deep inside, Elias felt something he hadn't known in years. Peace. The mountains had taken everything from him once, his trade, his hand, his fortune. But they'd given something back, now a name worth remembering. By the time the wind swallowed the fort from view, Elias Carter was already planning the next frame of his saloon. The Fool's Rest would rise again. This time, not just as a place to drink, but as the safest corner in a world that had forgotten what safety meant. Spring came to the valley like a truce. The snow melted from the slopes first, trickling into streams that swelled the green river until it roared again with life. The meadow grass rose green and tender, and the hills, once white with death, turned gold with sunlight. When the first wagon trains rolled out of the east, they found the Fool's Rest standing once more rebuilt from ashes, stronger than before. The new saloon sat on the same rise, its timbers straight, its walls sealed tight against wind and time. Elias Carter had raised it with his one good hand and the help of 2 Elks, who stayed through the thaw. Together they worked like men possessed, hauling logs, carving beams, and setting stone. What had burned in fury now stood as proof that some things on the frontier could still be rebuilt. Word spread fast. The fool had risen from the fire. By summer, the trails were alive again, emigrants bound for Oregon and California, traders, soldiers, and scouts. All of them stopped at Carter's place. They came not just for whiskey, though the whiskey was better now, brought in from Bridger's new shipments. They came because it was safe. No man drew a gun there. No horse thief dared cross its door. It was said that even outlaws doffed their hats before stepping inside. The burned logs from the old saloon had been stacked into a low fence out front, a reminder of what came to those who brought violence to that ground. Elias never spoke of Varn again, nor of the night of fire. When men asked, he'd only say, "The mountains took him." That was enough. He kept his rules simple, same as before: no guns drawn, no credit, no blood on the floor. Those who broke them were shown the mountain code's swift and cold justice. But rarely did he need to raise his voice. His quiet presence, the calm in his weathered eyes, did most of the work. The travelers began to talk. They said Carter's saloon was a kind of miracle, a place where feuds stopped, where men who'd spent months on the trail could sit, share a drink, and remember what peace felt like. Freighters called it the safest place in the West. And so it was. That summer, Jim Bridger himself stopped by on his way to Fort Hall. He found Elias leaning against the doorway, the hook of his hand gleaming in the sunlight. "Still keepin' fools safe, I see," Bridger said, smiling. Elias chuckled. "Every man's a fool somewhere, Jim. Might as well give him a roof for it." Bridger looked around, nodding at the travelers gathered under the porch. "You done something here, Carter. Ain't many men can carve peace out of this land." Elias shrugged. "Peace ain't carved. It's traded for one man's temper, another's pride. Costs plenty, but it's worth the price." 2 Elks came from the corral then, a coil of rope over his shoulder. His hair was streaked with gray now, but his step was still light. He'd built a small lodge near the river, hunting and trading hides with the Shoshone. Yet every evening he came back to the saloon, sat by the fire, and smoked in silence beside Elias. That night the two men sat as they always did, the lamp burning low, the talk in the room gentle and tired. Outside, the coyotes sang to the moon, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the open door. Two elks broke the silence. "You remember the first fire?" Elias nodded. "I do." Two elks smiled faintly. "You said it was the end." "I was wrong," Elias said. "It was just the beginning." He reached for his tin cup, poured them each a small drink. "To the mountain code," he said. Two elks raised his cup. "To fools who remember it." They drank in silence. The night stretched long and kind around them. Beyond the door, wagon fires flickered in the valley, families, dreamers, and drifters finding rest under a fool's roof. Years later, long after both men were gone, travelers still told the story. They said there'd once been a saloon west of Fort Bridger, where a one-handed trapper and a Crow warrior made peace in a land that knew none. Some said their ghosts kept watch on stormy nights, keeping the whiskey warm and the doors barred against evil. Whether true or not, the legend endured of the fool who built a haven in the wilderness, and of the Fool's Rest, the safest place in the West.